Welcome to Sustainable Packaging Podcast with Cory Connors, brought to you by Landsberg Aurora. I'm very excited to introduce my very good friend, Mr. Chandru Wadwani. He is the Joint Managing Director of Extra Pet. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you. Good to be here and good to see you.
Thank you so much for making some time for this. I know you're all the way over in South Africa. And I just can't wait to hear your perspective on sustainable packaging. So tell us how you got into recycling as a career.
To be very honest, by total good fortune, it was a bit of a midlife crisis. I had left the family business in Nigeria, relocated to the UK, met my wife-to-be, who's Canadian, in the beautiful city of Rome, Italy. Worked out that if I had any hope of marrying her, I better find a job of some. And my brother-in-law came to me to say, we're starting a recycling business in South Africa and we need someone to run it just for 2 years. My first answer was no chance. I'm done with the African continent. I want to live in the Western world. And he very kindly persuaded me and paid for a trip down. It was the first time I'd ever been, Cory. And like most people who come here the first time, it's just mind blowing. And I couldn't sign up quick enough. That was in the year 2001. And what was meant to be a 2-year assignment just hasn't stopped, and it's been a real blessing. So by good fortune, to be honest.
That's wonderful. I've never been to South Africa. It's definitely on my list. So I'd love to come visit you someday. Yeah.
Very welcome.
Well, we met on Clubhouse in sustainable packaging rooms, and you have become the resident expert on recycling. And so we're thrilled to have you on this show because I think that's an important perspective of how to be sustainable. So can you tell us about your company and what you guys do in the recycling space?
Yeah, I mean, our focus is the recycling of plastic bottles, primarily PET, polyethylene terephthalate. We also recycle high density polyethylene bottles, which are your milk bottles. It was done because the family that owned this business out of West Africa originated in the textile space. So PET bottles are a raw material to make polyester fiber. We started here, as I said, in the year 2001, and it just grew to such a level that eventually we acquired a polyester fiber business in Cape Town, probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world. So we make fiber in Cape Town. But early, mid-2007, we started getting a lot of pressure from the retailers and brand owners. Other parts of the world had started on their circular economy journey. And the big debate was, we create so much waste of undiscarded PET bottles. Why are we using oil to go make new PET bottles? Why can't we use old bottles and go back to new bottles? So it took us about 2 years to do our homework. We invested in some European technology. And in 2009, we put up the first food grade rPET plant. And in January of this year, we commissioned the third line. So a big part of what we do is circular, to make a resin that's food safe to the caliber of US FDA regulations, European food safety regulations, brand owners like Coca-Cola, Pepsi regulations. We also, over and above making fiber, make a product that's known as monofilament. If you look at your brooms and your brushes, those bristles at the bottom are now made from recycled bottles. And we make an industrial grade strapping. So if ever you look at a construction site, you might see a block of bricks bound together by a green strap. It's also used in packaging. So we also make strapping from the green PET bottles. On the HDPE side, we make a resin that goes into non-food bottles. So they probably make products like shampoo or kitchen surface cleaner bottles, as well as other products like industrial grade pipe or film. So that's kind of what we do.
Oh, really? So not only are you recycling, you're upcycling or downcycling the materials.
Value add, because I think the premise of any recycling is collect and do what. And when you're beholden to third-party converters and brand owners to procure your products, you get these challenges in the recycling sort of cycle that at times there are no buyers. So the ability to be your own buyer of your own material is actually a good kind of buffer of what's a very challenging economic cycle in recycling, as you'll know as well.
That makes a lot of sense and makes a lot of dollars too. Well done.
Not always, but it's feast or famine. And to be very fair, when it does strike, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, and I applaud you for your efforts and the way that you guys have attacked this issue and are making a true dent in the problem of waste in our world. So, well, you've introduced me to the idea of extended producer responsibility, and I want to thank you for that. But could you explain that to our audience and how South Africa has implemented that or is implementing that?
Absolutely. Extended producer responsibility in a nutshell talks to the definition of the producer of a product. In our case, it's the company that made it, as well as the brand owner on whose name it is, to take responsibility for their product at end of life. South Africa recently gazetted into law last month 3 gazettes. One was for paper and packaging. Second one was for lighting and lighting components. And the third one, which is by far a much bigger waste stream, is electrical and electronic components. So these are your laptops and your cell phones and your fridges and your freezers, all of which have an end of life. So in a nutshell, going forward, we will not be allowed to sell these products or manufacture these products in the Republic of South Africa or import them if you have not set up what's known as a producer responsibility organization to demonstrate to government that you have a plan to recover prescribed minimum recovery rates for many products, as well as how it's going to be recycled. And they've got one step further to actually, in some cases, like beverage PET bottles, put in mandatory minimum inclusion rates of PCR, post-consumer recycling. So it's now law. The big bell sounds on November the 5th this year.
Oh, wow.
And if you are not registered and compliant, then you're trading illegally in South Africa.
It's incredible. And absolutely, I think you guys are guiding the way for the rest of us. It seems, although like an article that you sent me recently, brands are starting to do this on their own. And I think that's pretty impressive.
Well, just on that very quickly, our 20-year existence prior to legislation was because of voluntary PR. There's an organization here called PETCO that represents the whole PET value chain from the virgin resin producer all the way to the retailer. And they had buy-in from probably north of 80% of the market. We
Wow.
put in a voluntary levy to support recycling. I mean, if I had to just look back in the last 20 years, there were probably 3 times, one of which was the 2009 global financial meltdown that happened, where we should have probably been out of business. And but for the support of the voluntary organization, PETCO and its members, big brand owners like Coca-Cola and all are part of it, we probably wouldn't be here today. But I think what's happened is governments globally have realized that such as the scale of consumption on the back of this incessant need to grow economies, and with more consumption obviously comes more waste, they've seen the need to make EPR now mandatory. And it's by no means unique to South Africa. And as I've shared with you, I think breaking news in many parts of America very soon, if not already legislated.
I agree. I think it's coming. Do you feel like the people who live in your community are interested in recycling? Or is it beneficial to them? Is it available to them?
So I don't know how dated the study is. It was estimated no more than 5% of the South African population participated in recycling. Wow. It's great if everyone's interested, but as you know, it doesn't help us if people don't participate. So the reality is, and especially for the part of the world I live in and where we do our business, there's far bigger challenges on day-to-day living. So you can't even blame people for not having recycling as a priority when, you know, housing yourself, medicating your family, educating your children, putting food on the table are far more pressing needs than today. But I don't think the same can be said for privileged parts of the world where economies are far more developed. And so the interest, to answer your question, is high, but sadly, as we see in many parts of the world, execution doesn't mirror that level.
That makes a lot of sense. And I really agree with you that we can't expect people to make this a top priority. We can hope and we can make it easy. I think as a community that's on the government and maybe recycling communities and the producers to make it simple for people and make it beneficial for people. Here where I live, we have a 10-cent bottle drop, refund for every bottle that you bring back. Oregon was the first place in the United States to attach a financial benefit to returning to recycling with our 5-cent bottle drop back in 1971. So that's an interesting little tidbit. So
yeah, I think a lot of parts of the world looking at that. But again, those are very, I use the word respectfully, it's very privileged because deposit systems need a lot of backup investment on collection systems and MRFs to be able to receive the material. So a lot of that cost gets passed on onto the product, but so it's really where consumers can afford it. But having said that, I think there are many parts of the world looking at that as a model for challenging items, where we're just, given up on hearing on promises of brand owners that they're going to recycle it. Well, if you're not, then here's a deposit system. Make it happen.
it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I agree.
Correct.
So this is a question I'm trying to ask everyone I interview. Do you think that packaging can be sustainable?
I do. And for the simple reason that 20 years down the line, I've identified the single source about why packaging fails. And the reason it fails at the beginning at design. So I'm a big advocate on design for recycling. And I'll just give you the example of PET bottles. We at our peak reached 68% recovery rate of beverage bottles, which is world class.
Wow.
But we didn't stop there. We had a look at the 32% we weren't collecting. And a small part of it was in unreachable areas or unaffordable to reach areas or logistical issues. But by far, the biggest chunk of that 32% failed just because they were designed to fail. What do I mean by that? Is the premise of any recycling, as I said earlier, is collect and do what? If you don't have end-use markets aligned to that recycle it, there was no point collected. So we had challenges with bottles with color. Not that it wasn't technically recyclable, there just wasn't an end-use market ready to buy it after we had recycled. Some bottles where they used neon colors, where there was no hope of having an end-use market. Some where they used opaque colors, some where they printed on the bottle. People don't know when you print on a PET bottle, PET melts at close to 300 degrees centigrade. So at that temperature, all that ink is going to purge into your recyclate, rendering it worthless. We then had guys using metal closures on a PET bottle, very fancy and good for marketing. So the big chunk of what didn't get recycled was because it failed at inception on design. So when I look at other packaging, and by that definition, other products, because now, fast fashion is on the spotlight and some of our fiber that we make from recycled bottles is starting to go into garments. But a lot of the questions are being challenged on is, well done, great story. You took a PET bottle and made a t-shirt, but that t-shirt is going to have an end of life. What's the plan for the t-shirt? And when you start looking at that, it comes back to one principle. Is it designed for the next life and the next life? And many a times when it fails, it's not. And when it fails, what happens? The cries are out there that packaging is not sustainable. So I think when it's not sustainable is because we failed ourselves. If we do design it to be have an end of life, then I think you'll find close to all of it will be picked up. So that's just what I've observed in 20 years.
Wow, I very well said. I agree 100%. It is on packaging companies and brands to make materials easily recycled or easily recyclable and out of as high PCR content as possible, in my opinion. And with those two things, I think you agree, we've discussed this in length, that we can make a real difference in this world. It's exciting.
Yeah. And the fact that it happens, I know your forte is on the paper side and cardboard. It's long before we came along, cardboard globally was being recycled at 70, 80, 90%. Why? Because it was just really easy to turn it into the next box and the next box.
Right.
So it's amazing how we have these wonderful glowing examples of success. And many a time I'm like, keep it simple. I find also sometimes we in the packaging industry overcomplicate our solutions. Right. I'm just waiting for that phone call where I get asked to turn a bottle into a rocket ship. I'm like, why? We've already got these wonderful cases that have worked for 20 to 30 years. Keep it simple. We've got good examples of how we can do it. Let's reuse it. And you've created that peripheral circular economy where ultimately it's not waste anymore, it's valuable raw material.
Absolutely agree. And that brings up another great point. Do you feel like the circular style packaging, like for example, what Loop is created, will be a large part of our market?
I've got to choose my words very wisely. I think what they aspire to do is well intended, not just me. I think a lot of commentary has reservation about its own sustainability as a model. Having done this long enough, I think where it'll end up, it'll be niche. It'll work in some parts of the world. It will work for certain packaging items, not others. But I think it might struggle to be sustainable as a system globally for every single packaging medium out there. But having said that, they definitely have a role to play.
I agree. And I'm excited to see what comes of it. I think, TerraCycle Loop, what they're doing is incredible and totally innovative. I do like the idea of, for example, a deodorant. So you get a stainless steel container, and then the refill becomes much smaller, much less packaging. And oftentimes the most sustainable packaging is just less packaging, or the smallest amount possible. So
9 out of 10 times, but we're on a big global campaign to caution brand owners. They're on this, you might have heard of lightweighting, where let's make the bottle lighter. Now, as a case in point, why is it globally products like polystyrene and plastic bags that get banned? It's not because they're not recyclable. They're actually very easy to recycle. The problem is when you're too light, there's no value in collecting. Right. So it's a challenge with collection that ties into recyclability that can't be ignored. And the danger for the PET industry and brand owners, if they make that bottle too light, then at some point there's no value in picking it up. And if you can't pick it up, everything else is just theoretical and academic. So I think 9 out of 10 times you're right. There's far too many examples of over packaging or using too much material. But there are some sensitive boundaries that brand owners have to be careful on not triggering. Plus, the ability to use PCR. They're finding now with food grade rPET, if that bottle is too light, by default, the wall thickness is too thin. Mm-hmm. And if it's too thin, it's limiting the percentage that you can put back in to make the next bottle. So there are these little subtle trade-offs, all of which vary globally, and just make it even more difficult and confusing for the consumer. But I think the awareness to brand owners who have to take responsibility, I'm seeing good signs that they're starting to pay attention. So it's not lightweighting. In the PET bottle industry, we now talk about right weighting.
Well, that's a term that's new to me. I haven't heard that. I like that. It makes
sense.
One
for you a month, Mr. Connors. Otherwise, I can't come onto your clubhouse room. I do my homework. You see,
you are an incredibly valuable part of our community on Clubhouse and in the world. Thank you so much for all that.
A great job.
I think we talked about a toothpaste brand that had a PET container that was so small that the recycling facilities couldn't recycle it. So they actually made it longer or larger to exactly to your point. So it could be recycled. So that's the kind of design for recycling that I think you're talking about.
Yeah, that's where sometimes we've got to put our hand on heart and give up our cause on fighting plastics is always the solution. I mean, if you go, days where you were traveling and going to hotels, what did they give you in the bathrooms? Were those miniature shampoo bottles. Mm-hmm. Reality is none of them would work through a PET recycling plant. Right. So what's the solution there? Well, go to glass or, tempered glass that won't break or something else that you could put up a closed loop collection system and derive value from it. So in those instances, plastic was not the answer. So I think sometimes we've got to be fair as well and stop being so defensive about the virtues of plastic, because sometimes paper is better, sometimes glass is better, sometimes no packaging is better.
Yeah, what if that could be a refillable container?
Correct.
that becomes refilled after every stay?
I've seen that as well. Correct.
There are so many solutions, And there are so many little changes that we can do as consumers and as packaging, people in all forms of that can absolutely make major impact on what happens in the world. I believe that.
You make a very valid point. I sympathize with the consumer, and I say it respectfully. I've given up on them being the ones that have got to come around to change and champion the cause. It's not going to happen. In the realms of the bigger challenge we have on climate change, the notion that we have enough time to educate every single consumer on what's a very difficult topic for those of us in the industry, let alone someone who's never had the benefit of being in this industry. I think the onus is now on us as brand owners and as producers of the packaging. And we know what to do.
Yeah.
I always chuckle when I hear the vainest excuses of why it can't be done. Cory,
yes,
people have the solutions already.
Yeah, they want to stand out on the shelf. They want to make an impact on the shelf, or we can do that. We can make stock packaging look beautiful. You don't have to have a new run every single time.
Correct.
And absolutely, things like black containers aren't visible to the eye of a MRF, a material recycling facility.
Auto sorters, absolutely right. Yeah.
I just learned that last week. I've been in this industry for 24 years, and that's on us, right? We gotta be able to tell our customers, don't use that kind of material. Don't use something that's too small. Here's another alternative and we can put a really beautiful label on it to make it look nice. So,
and maybe that's a challenge to us. I think we have to be a bit bolder on calling out the bad examples.
Yeah, it's okay to say, hey guys, maybe that wasn't the right choice. Let's look at these options. Here's 3 alternatives that are still beautiful, that your consumer will be excited to buy, because there's nothing sustainable about going out of business. We need these companies to be successful, but at the same time have packaging that's recyclable. Yeah,
correct.
Right.
Fully agree.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate your wisdom. I'd love to hear, can you tell us how to get a hold of you as your company and what you're doing?
Absolutely. We're very big on LinkedIn. A lot of our different divisions have their own LinkedIn pages. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll connect to many of those. I think you and I spend a lot of time on that. I love the stuff you're putting up there. I think it's so helpful.
Thank you.
I find people like to put up resourceful stuff, but it's not always helpful.
Yeah.
I'm on Twitter. My handle is @GotBottle. It's a British slang for, do you have the gumption and the strength to call it out? I'm very vocal on that. So I think that's probably the best way to stay in touch with us and on Clubhouse. And, I've learned a lot from your room as well. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of it.
Thank you, sir. And I'll put all the notes in the show notes so that people can reach you. And that's Extrupet, EXTRUPET. That's your okay. All right. Thank you so much, Chandru. You're a great man, and I appreciate you.
I'm in good company, Mr. Connors. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.